Hello and welcome to the UNDP Hour at the Stockholm Plus 50 Climate Hub, a stage and an online space available to you during, after, and before even the climate conference in Stockholm Plus 50. And it lasts until the World Environment Day on the 5th of June. My name is Isabella Lövin. I am chair of the board at the Stockholm Environment Institute, and I was previously the climate minister and also the deputy prime minister of Sweden. Our session today is about climate and inequality. The rapid acceleration of climate change presents the biggest existential threat to humanity ever known. Just like the COVID-19 pandemic, it affects everyone, but not equally. While no one will be immune to the increasingly savage effects of our heating planet, it is the poor and vulnerable people who will pay the highest price of inaction. Climate change and inequality are linked. And there's more. Climate change and inequality are such a large issue which affects practically everyone on Earth. But how do we communicate about it? How do we convey this story to a wide audience, as wide as possible? And how do we move for action? We will talk on all that with Cassie Flynn, Strategic Advisor on Climate Change at the UNDP, with Boaz Baldi, who leads UNDP's global campaigns and partnerships, and Alison Matthews, Head of Education at Microsoft, with the video game Minecraft. And lastly, in our last segment today, you will hear from Young Climate Leaders, which is a daily special segment for the days of the conference. And it's especially important for us to give youth leaders and activists the stage, because they are the ones that will be most affected by climate change, and they also have an enormously important role in taking action. So let me now start by welcoming Cassie Flynn to the stage, Strategic Advisor on Climate Change at the UN Development Programme. Cassie, please come up to the stage and stand here beside me, or I can stand here and you can stand there at this table. So great to see you and have you here in Stockholm. So let me just put the first question to you. How is climate and inequality connected? How is climate change exacerbating inequalities?
Well, it's such a pleasure to be here, and forgive me for my voice. I've done so much talking here at Stockholm Plus 50, I think I'm already starting to lose it. The question that you ask is so important. How we think about the impacts of climate change and inequality really will shape our future and shape how we can solve this crisis. And this question that you asked and what you said about how climate change doesn't affect everyone equally is so important, because we're all familiar with these big impacts of climate change. We see them in the news every day, the big floods, the storms, sea level rise, wildfires. But the reality is that when those impacts hit people and communities, it is never an equal experience. And depending on where you live, depending on your level of education, your level of income, what you have access to, can mean that a single storm can be something that, you can survive and get through and have access to something like insurance to recover from, or it can mean a complete disruption of your life, your family's life, and your entire community's lives.
So the people that don't have a margin will actually be the ones that will be immediately hit by the effects of climate change, while we who live in the more the rich part of the world, we have the insurances and so on. Preparing for this talk, I really was amazed, or rather frightened, by some statistics that I read about, that inequality is actually growing for more than 70% of the global population right now. And up to 132 million people would be pushed into extreme poverty by 2030 already, if we don't address climate change and of course also inequality. And another number, just going to underline that already the last 10 years, 410,000 people have been lost. Their lives have been lost in extreme weather events, and mostly in lower middle-income countries in climate-related disasters. So how can we use these figures to try to predict the future and try to prevent the worst outcomes that we see?
Right. The data is overwhelming. When you hear numbers like that, it's hard to even comprehend what these numbers mean. But what they all symbolize when you take them together is that the world is changing. And as we experience all of these climate impacts, one after another, we're starting to see real diversions in how people have access to opportunities, how people have access to being able to live the lives that they want to live. We think about when you're young and you think about, I want to have a certain career, or I want to live in a certain place, I want to be able to fulfill my dreams. That depends on being able to have a stable world, being able to have a stable planet.
Absolutely.
And when you don't have that stability, you start seeing a lot of those opportunities start to erode. And in some communities, especially women, girls, you start to see those opportunities start to erode faster. And this is something that we have to address and not get intimidated by these big numbers, but instead really start to make choices in a transformational way that can address these issues here and now.
So actually, climate change is adding upon other threats to stability and well-being of humanity. For instance, gender equality. We already know all too well that 50% of the world's population don't have an equal situation to the other half just by being born a woman or a girl. So could you say a little bit more of how the climate change is going to make the gender equality even more difficult if we don't address climate change?
The story of gender and climate is something that is so critical for how we understand the climate crisis. Because when we even start to look, and kind of even going back to some of these big statistics, that when you look at who's most impacted by some of these big climate shocks, it is always women and girls first. That when a drought hits or a storm hits, that women and girls are the ones that are by far the most affected because they often don't have access to the power or institutions that others have. We've also seen too the immense role of women and girls in solving the climate crisis.
That's a good point.
And I heard this fantastic statistic the other day, and I don't know where it's cited, but that when a storm hits, the number one indicator for the resilience of that community is the level of education of young girls.
Right.
And when you think about that, that's incredible. You think about the role that women and girls play in the recovery of these. Not just that they are impacted by these horrible climate effects, but that they also have a key role to play, and we need to support women and girls' leadership in getting ourselves out of this mess.
And getting girls to go to school and having the right to education. I think that's an extremely important point. Before we move on, I just want to ask you, what is the Climate Promise, the program that you are leading at UNDP? Could you describe it?
Well, the Climate Promise is UNDP's effort to support countries of the world to be as ambitious as possible under the Paris Agreement. The real aim of the Paris Agreement is for every country to make a pledge on climate change every 5 years and then to fulfill those pledges. And so what we set out to do at UNDP was to really try to help all countries to be able to have access to knowledge and networks and partnerships to be able to be as ambitious as possible and then to be able to fulfill those pledges. We're operational in about 121 countries and territories. It's about 85% of developing countries in the world. And we're really proud to say that we've been able to support countries at this critical time.
Well, that's really great, because there's a need to support countries, but also to share technology, share resources, and best practices. And I think UNDP is extremely well placed in the UN system to do just that. So that's excellent. And I know many countries are supporting the program through you. So this is one of the pledges from Copenhagen to support the developing world, and we're very happy that the UNDP is being strong on that. So I'm going to introduce one colleague of yours, and it's really taking the discussion to the next step. The magnitude of the problem, the challenge are also obvious to all of us. But how do we inform people? And more importantly, how do we encourage action? And we start the talk about this aspect joined by your colleague, Cassie. It's Boaz Paldi, who is here. I can see him via Zoom from New York. Boaz, thank you so much for joining us. And let me ask you, first of all, you just recently led the first kind of advocacy campaign for UNDP about climate and inequality. Could you tell us about that? And now we don't get the sound. Can we just...
Sorry about that. I think I was on mute. Can you hear me now?
Now we can hear you. Okay, great. Great to have you here.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me here. It's always very difficult to speak after Cassie because she's so eloquent and so brilliant. So I always feel, oh my God, I'm after Cassie. So I'm going to try my best. One piece of the puzzle, as you said, is trying to reach people around the world. There is, perhaps 10% of the world's population who are climate activists, who are engaged in a very, very high level, and don't really need to be reached. There's another 10% that truly believe that the climate change is a Chinese conspiracy or some other theory, and they are almost impossible to reach. So there's no really point in trying. That leaves 80% of the population of the world that probably believe that climate change is happening, but have yet to take action. That they think that it might not be their problem. They think that they might not be able to be the solution. They think that they are not empowered to take action, and so therefore they don't take action. But how do you reach those people? How do you reach those 80% of the population of the world with a message of climate action that is so desperately needed? We at UNDP thought about tackling one of the pieces of the puzzle that's extremely important to moving forward with decarbonization, with greening our environment, with greening our economies, and that is fossil fuel subsidy reform. There is last year, $423 billion were used for fossil fuel subsidies, and 80% of that goes to producers, manufacturers, and that skews the economy. That essentially makes it seem like renewables are more expensive than they are, and fossil fuels are cheaper than they actually are because governments are subsidizing them. It also creates a deficit in climate action, $423 billion in deficit. So anything that we do for positive climate action, we're still in the red. So it's incredibly important to reduce this deficit of negative impacts to the planet. And our thought was that there is, as Cassie mentioned, there is an enormous amount of people living out there that are not facing this crisis equally, that are being affected more than others, and those are the poor, the vulnerable, the least developed, etc. But then you have a bucket of money on one end, 423 billion last year. This year it's going to be 600 billion, according to our estimates, because of the rising price of fuels. And then on the other hand, you have a problem with inequality. Okay. So why don't we take this sum of money and move it to positive action? We could imagine what we could do with these funds. We could create green jobs. We can give some kind of universal basic income or temporary basic income. We could vaccinate everyone around the world for COVID-19 4 times over. So there's a huge positive impact that we could have if we somehow manage to reduce the fossil fuel subsidies and use that money for positive social impact. But it's just taken me 10 minutes to explain that to you, more or less, or 4 minutes. We need to explain it in a very simple way that those 80% of the people will understand, but not only understand, will then take action. So in this particular case, we know that doom and gloom campaigns don't work. People don't want to hear that there is no hope. They want to be part of the solution. They want to be part of hope. So it needs to be a message of hope. And we thought we'd just go at it at a little bit of a funny angle. So I think we can cue a video if that works. And we brought in an expert to help us explain the problem. If we can cue video and play it, that'll be awesome.
Great.
You okay? You need a minute? Cool. Okay. Listen up, people. I know a thing or two about extinction. And let me tell you, and you'd kind of think this would be obvious, going extinct is a bad thing. And driving yourselves extinct? In 70 million years, that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. At least we had an asteroid. What's your excuse? You're headed for a climate disaster, and yet every year governments spend hundreds of billions of public funds on fossil fuel subsidies. Imagine if we had spent hundreds of billions per year subsidizing giant meteors. That's what you're doing right now. Think of all the other things you could do with that money. Around the world, people are living in poverty. Don't you think helping them would make more sense than, I don't know, paying for the demise of your entire species? Let me be real for a second. You've got a huge opportunity right now. As you rebuild your economies and bounce back from this pandemic, this is humanity's big chance. So here's my wild idea. Don't choose extinction. Save your species before it's too late. It's time for you humans to stop making excuses and start making changes. Thank you.
Well, I think those were very wise words and a good advice to all of us to don't choose extinction. I really love Frankie the dinosaur and this message, and I think it also appeals to a very broad public, which is fantastic, and we need that kind of messages that are very clear. But one of the most important audiences would be youth, who are already taking action, and of course, children. But how do you engage them? How do we turn climate action into an engaging topic for them, one that will lead to action one day? So on that topic, I would like to talk with Alison Matthews, who's head of Minecraft Education. So Alison, please come up to the stage and join us here in our cozy sofa setting. Very welcome. And I'm very curious about your work with Minecraft and on climate education and environmental education. Could you tell me how did it all start, and how do you reach a younger generation?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I should make a statement about the space that we're actually in here first. We're in this beautiful venue that was actually created for gaming.
That's
which,
right.
And the fact that buildings like this are popping up in cities all over the world just goes to show that gaming's kind of a big deal for our younger generation. So I'm here to represent and empower young people's voices on the climate crisis. Often young people don't have a vote, they don't have really a way to let people in power know what it is that they want them to do with respect to the climate crisis. And so how can we engage them in dialogue? Honestly, we're already doing that with video games. So the video game industry is bigger than movies and music combined. And
That's amazing. I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's huge. So I work for Mojang Studios, so we produce Minecraft. Minecraft has over 140 million players every month. And then I work for Minecraft Education. We have millions more students in classrooms all over the world using Minecraft to learn about all kinds of things. So with this, the size of the platform that we have, we've made a commitment to address the world's toughest topics, whether it's through educational content on things like how to be a more active citizen, or things like climate futures. So young people can start to understand what they're facing, what we are facing, and then start to generate opinions on what we should do about it.
Okay, but how did it start? How did you start this initiative, and how did you get involved in it personally?
Yeah, so we actually learned from our community that Minecraft is actually a really powerful medium for learning tough topics. So I'll give you just a simple example. I was a pretty good student in high school. I got A's. I thought that I understood topics like chemistry. But honestly, it wasn't until I got into this 3D immersive world and started interacting with an element constructor where I could add protons and neutrons and see tangibly in this environment what a molecule is or what an element is, that I actually got it. So let me back up for a second and tell you sort of what Minecraft is. I think if you're a parent, you probably get it. But if you're not, Minecraft is a blocky sandbox, a 3D virtual world where you can immerse and you can go on adventures with your friends, or you can create whatever you want. And so basically you can create things limited only by your imagination. So in an environment like that, it's a perfect place for us to challenge young people to think about a world that is more sustainable, or to design solutions for the climate crisis, and then show us what they want us to do. So I can tell you a bit about that if you want.
Yeah, and you're already working in cities worldwide to reach children. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So last fall, we ran a Global Build Challenge in partnership with UNESCO. And we challenged young people to think about how they could remake their community to live in peace with nature. We got thousands of submissions back from all over the world. We had designs for like gorgeous towers that captured carbon and recycled water and created habitat for wildlife at the same time. We had one video where the team was suggesting that everything in the new world should be made out of mushrooms because they're so sustainable. There was an incredibly powerful video that came to us from Indonesia where you could viscerally feel the pain that the students felt watching their local wildlife habitat burn in climate-related fires. So what we learned from that was these voices, first of all, young people want to be heard. And second of all, their ideas were too powerful to just end with us. So we started to think about how can we make these videos and these voices, how can we get them in front of people who are in positions of power to hear them and then ideally take action on what young people are asking them to do. And so that led to conversations with mayors, for example, Mayor Anna here in Stockholm, who wanted to figure out how she could engage more with the citizens in her city to hear from them what kind of city they wanted to create and what they wanted to live in. So,
thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, Cassie, reaching out to young audiences through the platforms where they live in is not new to you, especially after leading Mission 1.5 for UNDP. What is Mission 1.5?
Well, Mission 1.5 is a gaming platform that we worked on at the United Nations Development Program to help people start to play and start to understand what will it take to keep global temperature rise below 1.5 degrees. So that's why it's called Mission 1.5. And I think, Allison, what you were saying was so important about gaming is the size of the film and music industry combined. That is mind-blowing. And when you think about new ways of engaging young people, you have to go to where they are. And increasingly, they are playing games. And this is something that we really wanted to do and really wanted to say, all right, well, we want to help educate young people about the climate crisis, but we also want to help give them a voice in how the climate crisis is solved. And so that's where we went with it.
And the People's Climate Vote, what was that?
Right. So this emerged from it. Our goal with Mission 1.5 was to help people to understand what are the solutions to the climate crisis? What do we have to do with our food systems, with our energy systems? How do we protect nature? What does that really look like? And when we started educating them about these solutions, we also asked them, what do you want your government to do? And it was a simple question, and we gave everyone a bunch of options across 6 different categories of solutions. And fast forward, it became the largest poll on climate change in history. Because we were able to reach so many people through gaming. And we were able to say, all right, well, globally, we know that 2/3 of people think that climate change is an emergency. And that was something that came directly out of that vote.
That's incredible. And what was the main message to world leaders?
Well, we wanted to really drive home that young people, in particular, often young people that may not be able to vote in elections, they are not employed, they don't have a lot of power in civic life at the moment. We wanted to give them a voice on the climate crisis. It's going to affect young people's lives more than anyone else, and they should have a voice in solving it. And that's really what we wanted to drive home.
But thank you very much both for really giving that platform for young people to both learn and to have a voice. And turning now, very much thank you to you, and now turning to our last segment of today's UNDP Hour. Climate change impacts everyone, but for the future, sorry. I'm not a professional on this, so I'm supposed to to introduce the Minecraft video. Or do you want to introduce it?
Sure, I can tell you a little bit about it. I can tee it up for a moment. I mentioned that we had engaged with a group of mayors to talk about how can we take the voices of young people in their communities and let them hear what they're trying to say. So we recently piloted what we called a net zero challenge. And we did a pilot in New York City and in Stockholm and actually in Austin, Texas. The goal being to work directly with city leaders to understand what are the most pressing concerns that they want to hear from young people on. And then we worked with the school districts in the city to do a build challenge with students in the city to first educate them on what was going on. So these students got to go on field trips to local parts of the city that are really at risk, learn about the factors of the risk and potential mitigations, and then they went back to the classroom, made a plan, and then came to us with came to us and to their city leaders with their suggestions for investments that should be made to improve the city. So what we're going to show you in the video is just kind of a behind the scenes of what happened in New York City for that challenge.
Thank you.
In New York City, we have issues with the environment, issues with transportation, issues with the overcrowding. Net Zero Challenge means that students are solution setting on what they could build to help get New York City net zero.
I think just any way that we can help to contribute to helping the environment, that would be great. Yeah. I'm a senior at John Dewey High School. I'm 17 and I'm president of Minecraft Club.
So the idea for getting the Minecraft Club involved in the beach cleanup was so that since they're researching the Net Zero Challenge, they need to go and wade in the creek, get those waders on, and go knee-deep in the water and seine for species. You see the students really understand as they're taking the water quality tests and understanding why is there chloroform in the water right now, and why is ammonia high, and the oxygen level. And so giving them that experience, that hands-on experience in the water so that they can understand what it's like to be in the creek, to see what they're going to be building in Minecraft. It's really important that the surface level knowledge goes much deeper, and we're building for conceptual understanding, and that students see themselves in green careers in the future.
In terms of learning, it's mostly us doing research outside of the game for the build challenges. And here now we're researching how to make buildings more sustainable and how we can incorporate all of our research into the game.
So the idea is that the students are creating and engineering a project that will help New York City. So wouldn't it be amazing that the students through this challenge actually solve a problem or get looked at, or real engineers and architects from New York City actually speak to these students? The answer's in the room somewhere. So wouldn't it be amazing if it came from our students?
So great. Alison, can you tell us some more about the reach of your initiative?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think from that video, it's clear that young people want to have a voice, and we're actually solving for a few different things by engaging classrooms and students in these sorts of topics. The first is we're going to potentially inspire them into careers so that they can move into the workforce and take over some of this work that's going to be so important as throughout their lives on sustainability and creating more resilient communities. There's also the issue of, at least in the country that I live in, anxiety and depression rates are skyrocketing, and a lot of that is because there isn't an outlet.
Yeah. So
studies have shown that forward action is one of the best ways to decrease some of that eco-anxiety. So education, planning, moving forward, preparing, building resilience, those sorts of things are super important. So to your question, why did we get into this in the first place? We actually were inspired by a book that the Dalai Lama wrote a couple of years ago, where he made a call for anyone who's involved in education to start teaching young people about skills like compassion and resilience and tolerance, things that are going to become even more important as the impacts of climate crisis start to increase with forced migration and things like that. People are going to have more of these, need to have more of these skills in order to be able to manage those things in a healthy way. So we started trying, what if we tackled some of these tough topics in a game? And the response we've seen has been huge. I think that there's a hunger for content like this because educators don't necessarily have curriculum for these sorts of things. And I know I can speak on behalf of just the gaming industry in general. There are lots of organizations and gaming studios that are thinking about this and working on this sort of topic, because we know it's super important.
Thank you for sharing that, and I think that's also a growing conversation in politics, but also in the civil society, that these values such as empathy or let's call it the moral compass that you need in order to save our planet must also be highlighted. And to be honest, that's not very often the case in the entertainment industry.
Well, and I think the thing that we're seeing, you mentioned the moral compass. So the videos that we get from students where they are imagining a better future, the moral clarity is just striking, that of course we have to do something about this crisis. And of course we have to preserve wild spaces for habitat. And if fossil fuels are the problem, then of course we have to stop burning them. So that clarity is really powerful for people to hear.
And we hear it from the children and the young people in the streets as well, with the Fridays for Future movement. Exactly the moral clarity of the message is so strong. Right. So, Cassie, circling back to Stockholm Plus 50, taking place not far here from us, what are your expectations from it? Could it be a good outcome?
Well, I think these conversations around Stockholm Plus 50 give us the opportunity to imagine a better future. What does it take? And everything from, so much of what we saw in that video about green buildings and engineering and how we live our lives. But also I think this issue of compassion, empathy, kindness, generosity, this moral clarity that we do need to be able to get us through this time. Because when we look around, sometimes I just feel like the world is upside down. It feels like, what is happening? And when we can start from a place of that moral clarity, and when we can start from a place of, okay, the challenge is hard, but we can have these conversations. We can start to think about what it takes to be able to build the future that we all know is possible. And that's why I'm really excited about Stockholm Plus 50 and the conversations that are happening this week.
But there's a lot of young people saying, well, this is yet another meeting with blah, blah, blah. What do you say, Alison? Is that the general feeling you would say among young people?
So I will admit that I'm fairly new to these sort of climate conversations. I did spend the day yesterday with some city leaders, and I mentioned to a couple of mayors that I was talking to that this was my first time going to an event like this. Is this how they always go? And they said, actually, this was much more like more of a fresh conversation, because they were having hard conversations about the effects of consumption in cities. And so I do believe that the tone is shifted to, we actually have to go. I do think that there is a lot of work that we need to do to engage young people, though, to give them a role here, because there's certainly a lot of work to do there, and we're working on it, and I think you are too. Yeah.
But maybe that will be also the next step with education through gaming, that also give an understanding of the political processes that need to kind of move in order to make the change that we need, so that young people don't feel this kind of distrust in the democratic systems or the adult world that hasn't really reacted to all the dangers. We're so-called celebrating the Stockholm Plus 50, the Stockholm Conference 50 years ago, but so little has happened really, or too little has happened and too late. That's also, I think, very much a takeaway for young people when they hear the statements that were made 50 years ago and see the result right now. So can we give more of a voice to the young people? What do you say from UNDP's side?
I don't even think it's a matter of can we have to.
Yeah.
It is not a choice. And as you said, I think there are a lot of young people who say, blah, blah, blah. We see these conferences in the news all the time. We're tired of it. We want action. And I think this is where young people being able to call for that action, being able to be involved, understanding how these processes work, that when you have nearly 200 countries getting together to talk about global issues, it is wildly complicated and very, very difficult. And we need young people to be in the middle of it. We need young people to be involved in these conversations in a substantive way. And I think this is where collectively we have a lot of work to do to make sure that happens in a meaningful way.
And actually this hour we've talked about inequality, climate and inequality. And Alison, you mentioned also the intergenerational inequality, that this generation is actually consuming so much of the resources that we must really preserve for our children and grandchildren and all the generations to come. Do you want to add to that?
You know, I mentioned the event I was at yesterday. I had like a sort of an epiphany about there was a call from UN Habitat for the Global North to provide more support to those in the Global South with technologies, the green technologies and things. But I think the Global North has a lot to learn from the Global South too, in terms of how to live a less energy-rich lifestyle, because we're just sort of born into a certain lifestyle when you live in the Global North, and you don't necessarily know how to change. So I think that there is room for a dialogue both ways.
Absolutely. And as the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, has underlined a number of times, we're at a crossroads. Either it's breakthrough or it's breakdown. And it's not an exaggeration. So the breakthrough would be also to look at other values, other ways of living, and also highlighting the rights of future generations and children's future. So thank you so much, both. Excuse me for interrupting you earlier on, but I had a little lapses in my cards. So great to have you here, both, and having a great discussion. And now we are going to talk about the last segment of UNDP Hour. So, as we have been talking about, climate change impacts everyone, but the future belongs to young people, and they will be affected by decisions taken today. The calls to act from young people is getting constantly louder, and youth-led action on climate change is growing strongly across the globe. Whether through education, activism, innovation, science or technology, young people are scaling up their efforts and using their skills to accelerate climate action. UNDP asked Clara Henry, the Nordic actress and TV personality, if she could interview young leaders on what is happening today in the Stockholm Plus 50 conference. She responded by bringing them into our studio. Over to you, Clara.
Thanks a lot, Isabella. I'm very excited to have this talk today here with two young leaders giving you the latest from within the conference. So give a warm welcome to Natalie Mongondo. You are the Youth Fellow in Finance with the UN Climate Change High-Level Champions Team. And Daniel Calarco, welcome. You are a lawyer and founder of the International Youth Watch. It's very good to have you here. And before we start talking about what's going on inside the conference, let's talk a bit about you two, so we get to know you. Daniel, you're the ambassador for Generation 17. Please tell us what that is.
And thank you so much for having us. I'm Daniel Calarco, and I'm the ambassador for Generation 17. That's an initiative led by UNGP and Samsung at the global level. As the head of the International Youth Watch, I'm representing Brazil in this global south in several agendas across the globe as Stockholm Plus 50. Our main commitment is to use technology to enhance youth voices on the achieving of the 17 goals. We have the Global Goals app. They can use in the palm of your hand. You can have information and access knowledge on how to accelerate the goals in your own community, overcoming all the language barriers because it's available in Portuguese, English, and I hope even in Swedish. So we make sure that young people know what the goals are and how they can implement it in their local communities.
Wonderful. We need more of that. And Natalie, your bio is very impressive, and you are doing a lot of different things, a lot of different projects about climate and the environment. Which one of these projects is closest to your heart?
I definitely say working within the Climate Champions team, because you might be familiar with the Conference of the Parties, and that usually works with states. But our mandate within the Climate Champions team is to work with non-state actors. And so that's everyone else, from cities to businesses to financial institutions to civil society organizations. And so being able to bring together so many people is what we need to accelerate change at the rate that we need to achieve what we want to achieve in time.
How come that one is your favorite one?
Because I think, you know, in this world we've become so polarized, working in our individual capacities. But the Climate Champions is really working to bring together everyone together to accelerate change at the right pace and scale.
So this week, all eyes are on Stockholm, on the conference. You both are inside at times. Tell us, what's the atmosphere like?
We are super excited to be here, living that. I saw thousands of people coming from all over the world. We have young people that are here to engage, for example, bringing to the table voice from indigenous community, people of color, LGBTQIA+. So we have intersectional voices coming from the young age, but also intergenerational dialogue with people who experienced 50 years ago the Stockholm meeting. So that's so impressive to have a room where dialogues can happen. It's such a diversity and also full of ideas background. So I'm super excited to be here and optimistic about the results.
Yeah, I'm also very optimistic because, you know, we've managed to bring together so many different stakeholders, from scientists to business to etc. And, you know, UNDP did these national consultations in over 50 developing countries, in my own countries, with, you know, CSOs, NGOs, people, women, young people with disabilities. And so really seeing that feed into the dialogues at such a high level event has just been incredible.
Wonderful to hear. And it's wonderful news for everybody who would like to be in Stockholm but can't be. So on a more substantial level, what are the most important things happening in the conference today? Anything we should look out for?
So, of course, you know, we have the plenary, the main plenary where the main negotiations are happening. But in addition to that, there's the leadership dialogues. So there's 3 main leadership dialogues. One is on reflecting on the past 50 years. The next is on sustainable recovery. And then the last one is on accelerating to ensure that we reach the targets that we want to reach in time.
You know, we also need to pay attention to the side events held by partners and other United Nations agencies as the Climate Hub. I would also recommend strongly to have a look on what young people are telling when they have this space on the stage. We have several panels about the Green Pact for Youth, empower young people, and what's coming next for this generation and how to create change. So after Stockholm, what to expect and how we can afford the change.
So from a young perspective, what would be a good outcome of this conference, these 2 days?
I think it's to move away from working in our silos because, you know, while it's important to be working in our specialized areas, we can't do it at the pace and the scale that we need to achieve the targets that we want to achieve. So including biodiversity loss, including pollution, that's a way that we can really have multi-dimensional outcomes for health, etc. So I think definitely moving out of our silos and working with other people.
Yes, I agree 100%. And also, we need to create a concrete agenda to move forward from this conference. We are in the decade of action, so you need concrete targets and goals so we can go together and walk together this walk. We know that we don't have time. That's not just a slogan. It's now or never because we are facing this tropical crisis across the globe, and we have an opportunity here to make sure that we understand that people need change and demands change right now. And we have the stakeholders, the political power, and the will to do so. A good outcome would be able to see how we can engage as also individuals, but subnational governments and municipalities, not only the member states, because people do not live in global agendas. So we have to make an effort to translate to local level and to make an effort to make sure that everybody's included. So I would strongly recommend that in that sense, that we are able to create this agenda, this concrete plan, so we can involve every single person as individual, as subnational governments, and state parts, and international agencies.
So it's been 50 years now since the very first climate conference held here in Stockholm. In which ways have youth been able to affect and participate in the decision-making of these conferences?
Yeah, I mean, you know, young people have been affecting from different areas, from advocacy to raising awareness all the way to policy. And we've actually been self-organizing with organizations such as Youngo to build our technical capacity so that when we have a seat at the table, we've been able to add a lot of value to the conversations. And so I think young people are just becoming more and more organized and more impactful because we're the most impacted by climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution.
Yes, our generation is facing climate anxiety because we are seeing the bad outcomes of a discussion that had little to no effort in some areas and across the globe. Like people from the global south and people from intersectional groups are being disproportionately impacted. That makes us to become more frustrated, but we cannot give up. Young people has been at the forefront of promoting and defending rights for years now, since 50 years ago, that I was not even born back then. Right? But I had the chance to engage in other conferences, as Heal Plus 20 and Heal Plus 30 conference. That's yet to happen. So young people from different generations used to, we are the rebels, the people who want to do the change and lead the change, and we can do so. Yeah. And we play a major role in making sure that we we address hard topics, but we make sure that the debate is also inclusive and that every single voice is heard, since we are disproportionately impacted and we need to be part of the solution.
Yeah, I agree. And like you said, Natalie, the ones affected both most and worst are the youth. So if there was anything you could say to the young people of the world, maybe watching this today, maybe experiencing this climate anxiety, as you said, Daniel, is there anything you would like to say to them?
Absolutely. I would say that I know it gets tiring. I know it gets very tiring, but keep working, keep calling on your governments, your cities, businesses to act, and keep being the change that you want to see in the world, because we are making an impact, and that you know, there are other generations that are working together behind the scenes with us to help support us. So look for those allies as well. So I wouldn't just speak to the younger generation, but I'd also speak to the older generation and say, be allies to your children, your younger sisters and brothers, etc.
It's like the High School Musical song, we're all in this together.
That's true. Just adding to that, we, as me and Natalie here, and you, Clara, in Stockholm, but we are not alone. You are not alone. We across the globe are working towards the same 17 goals. And also, we can do more together. So remember that every single act matters. So if you support and spread knowledge, if you raise awareness about climate change, if you do your part as an individual, as a family member, as a school student, that's really important. As I mentioned before, all these global agendas takes place in the local level. There is no better and inclusive future without local grassroots work. So every single thing you do matters. Your voice matters. Your life matters. And remember that you are part of a great movement that's led and started way before us with the people who came before us. But now we have the chance, the capacity, and the ability to do the change. So we rely on you. Even if you are joining online and across the globe, remember that you have allies in Stockholm.
That's wonderful advice and encouragement, I think. Do you think that young voices are listened to more now than they were before? What do you think, Natalie?
I'd definitely say young voices are listened to more, but they're still not listened to enough. And that's what we're both working towards, to ensure that young people are listened to, because we do add value to the conversation in our many ways, whether it's through protesting, whether it's through policy action. All the actions that young people are doing really do matter. And so we add value in many different ways, and there's a place for every type of activism in this movement.
Yes, we conquered more space in the last years. Fridays for Futures and other movements across the globe make sure that youth became a more political organized power to demand a seat at the table. But we have a long journey to go yet, because the youth, although we may have a lot of a lot of more coverage, for example, in media or because of the social media that we are experts on that. We have a lot of challenges, for example, access funding and support to do bigger change, even for national governments and international organizations. So we need to have hard conversations about make sure that young people have a seat at the table, but as stakeholders with the capacity to implement our demands and to make sure the change we are planning is taking place on the ground.
And if I can just add to that, you mentioned funding and resources. I think, it's important to recognize that young people have the fewest resources to respond to and recover from climate change. And so even at these international dialogues, it's very difficult for young people to get here. So those young people who aren't here, we're advocating for you 100%.
So what do you think, just a final question, what do you think are the biggest challenges of engaging youth and creating a platform for youth to speak up and make actual change in the decision making in conferences like this? It's a big question. I'm sorry.
It's a tough question, but it's a question that needs to be asked by member states, international organizations. In the sense, we do need to support young people by providing funding, training, in the sense of capacity building, and making sure that they're inclusive in the meetings like that decision making is happening. So that would my three tips on how to make sure that youth engagement is effective, make sure we have access to funding, that we are present in the decision making process as stakeholders, and that we are training to as you mentioned, we have value to add to the table since we have access to information. And you?
Not just as stakeholders, but as partners. We shouldn't just be speaking at events. We should be incorporated into the design, into the implementation, into the funding, into the monitoring and evaluation. Young people need to be included every step of the way, not just, for different campaigns. Yeah,
and we're part of all discussions, right? Climate change, economic development, gender equality. So young people need to talk about every single topic that may affect us now or in the future.
And future generations as well. People, at Stockholm Plus 100, we're going to be the old people at the table. And we need to be allies to the future generations as well.
Yeah, that's right. Daniel, Natalie, thank you so much for your very valuable analysis and update about what's going on inside the conference. I have nothing more to say than back to you, Isabella.
And Thank you very much, Clara. Thank you, young leaders. I do hope that we will not have a Stockholm Plus 100 in 50 years, but that we will solve our environmental problems by then. So thank you to the audience for joining us. The next Stockholm Plus 50 Climate Hub session is tomorrow. Your host of the hour tomorrow will be Victor Galas for a session on climate innovation. So see you all tomorrow at noon. I'm Isabella Lövin. Thank you very much for watching.
Welcome to this third of this week's Exponential Race to Zero shows, brought to you by We Don't Have Time, the Exponential Road Map Initiative, the UN Race to Zero, and the We Mean